Gibraltar is blessed with a rich variety of natural and human history. The rock and the town below have been home to many cultures and people over the centuries. The artifacts, monuments and memories that remain become our heritage, a common inheritance which we all share. And as Gibraltar moves forward and grows, it is up to us as a society to make sure this heritage endures and becomes a part of our future as well. Leading this effort is the Gibraltar Heritage Trust, an independent statutory body entrusted with the preservation of our heritage, whose aim it is to ensure that modern Gibraltar retains history and heritage at its heart. Gibraltar's military history is apparent in its imposing defensive walls, gun positions, and countless other sites that have bestowed on the rock its reputation as a formidable fortress in numerous sieges and wars. But warfare and defense is not the only element of military life represented within Gibraltar's rich history. Proudly standing at the head of Governor's Parade is the Garrison Library, a gem within Gibraltar's Old Town. This building has been a centre of discourse, knowledge and recreation since its founding in the late 1700s. Dr. Jennifer Ballantine-Perera tells us more about the proud legacy of this noble building.
Hello, my name is Dr. Jennifer Ballantine-Perera. I'm the director of the Garrison Library, and welcome to my library. So the Garrison Library is established in 1793. But in reality, this building dates from 1800, completed in 1804. So the library has a much longer history than as we see it now in its current footprint. The library is established on the back of the Great Siege, actually, during which time there were many, many long periods with no activity, very quiet moments, and this was not good for the soldiers. So at that time, Drinkwater, later to become Colonel Drinkwater, felt that what Gibraltar needed, especially what the military contingent needed over here, was a library. A library to keep soldiers' minds at ease, to keep them entertained, so that during those quiet moments, their minds wouldn't be drifting towards despair, suicide, desertion, which are really key elements as to why the library was initiated. Drinkwater then sets about establishing a library, initially as a public library, which is interesting because what we had in the end was the establishment in 1793 of what you see today, a private subscription library, which is a very English thing in a way. And you had many other subscription libraries being set up in the UK at that time. And therefore the Garrison Library follows that model. So the library, when it's established in 1793, it's for a private set of members, officers of the garrison. And they're wealthy, they're moneyed, they're cultured, and they put their money together and their collections together to establish what is the Garrison Library collections. But by 1799, in fact, they had outgrown their premises and they start looking for a larger space in which to house their current collection and to grow. And this is what they do. Also through private subscription amongst their members, they start asking for donations and funds. But clearly their vision for a library was far greater than the cash they had to hand. So this is what they do, which is very interesting, and it tells us something about the fabric of the building, why this building looks the way it is. They write a letter to the King of England, to George III, and they say, we're a bunch of officers, we have a huge vision over here for an important library in Gibraltar, which will be of service to the military contingent in Gibraltar. And this is what the king says. He says, yep, I think that this is important. So not only will I give you the money to build this stupendous building, I will give you the freehold of the land, which Gibraltar at that time, you can imagine, so soon after the siege, is hugely important. And what we have is the king awarding the Garrison Library Committee with funds to be able to build this beautiful Georgian building that you see behind me. Pure Georgian dimensions. And clearly it's of its period, it's of its time, and it was funded by the King of England, George III. Important for two reasons. Obviously, so soon after the siege, Gibraltar had been practically razed to the ground. And what we see here in the centre of town is a very potent symbol of British sovereignty over Gibraltar, a very potent symbol of empire, because the king himself paid for this library, awarded the freehold to the committee overseeing the library, and at such an important juncture in our history, we find that this library becomes dead centre of town, an important symbol of this support that Gibraltar has always had from the British.
Sitting at the centre of a busy part of town for over 200 years, the Garrison Library has not been immune to the ravages of time. Pollution from traffic as well as weather factors have contributed to the deterioration of several areas of the library, a factor which is now being remedied with input from a team of government officers, contractors and the Gibraltar Heritage Trust.
I'd like to talk a little bit now about the restoration projects currently being carried out at the Garrison Library. And this balustrade is one of them. Many of you will have noticed that this project has been ongoing, I think, for now almost a year. And there's a reason for that. Clearly, a restoration project of this ilk needs time, but also needs expertise and clear thought in how to balance what is a heritage imperative alongside a health and safety one. The problem with the balustrade was this, masonry, fallen masonry. And as you know, we have a pavement below us and traffic. And, well, we needed to repair the fabric of the balustrade, but always being very mindful of its conservation. And this has been a lengthy process, making this safe. When we started work now almost a year ago, we realized that the balustrade had undergone a previous restoration, probably during the late 19th century. The balustrade is made from sandstone with all its supporting stone of limestone, and the degraded elements are the sandstone elements. And that actually led to a bit of a dilemma. We clearly needed to replace some of the sandstone elements because they had not stood the test of time. 20th century pollution, 21st century pollution, which is far worse. We're in a garden, trees, they also have an impact on the stone. So we brought the project to a halt to be able to source limestone elements, which were important to replace some of the more degraded sandstone. Finding the limestone of a very similar tone has been a challenge. We're in Gibraltar. This is a Georgian building. Had we been in the UK, this would have been perhaps slightly easier. So what we've done is we carried out 3 due diligence exercises. The first was to have a replica of one of the balustrade elements, and the elements that we are replicating are these actually. So we used one of our best limestone elements and had a concrete one made. We had a limestone one made, which was good, but not good enough. It had a very high level of sandstone in it. And we went back and we've now had a replica made in limestone, perfect match. Of course, it will be newer than what we see over here, but that is to be expected, and neither do we want to falsify history in any way. A heritage project has to be very mindful of these ethical considerations. We're not here to falsify history, to pass something new off as old, but actually to restore the balustrade, firstly, that it be sound, that it be safe, and secondly, that it be integral, that it shows that the restoration has taken place, and this is just an added historical layer to the history of the balustrade. To contextualize this front garden historically for you, this would have been a wonderful space, obviously raised from the parade behind us. There would have been a spot over here for people to sit down, sit in the sun, to read. I remember that even when I was very young, there were tables out here in the front garden. There'd be a small restaurant. Patrons of the library would come and sit down. Children would come in and borrow books as well. Therefore, I think the aim would be for us to restore this space so that it would become vibrant again, vibrant and alive in the way that it was. Clearly, the terms have changed. Up until 2011, this was still a private subscription library. It's now an open access library, open to the public, to every Gibraltarian and anybody who wishes to come to the library. This is an important move for us. Restoring this garden means opening up this space for people to use it. Hopefully, I think if you can join me on a later occasion, we can show you how we've moved forward. What we have done already is we've started restoring part of the garden, and that is an important move for us as well.
The Gibraltar Chronicle, first published in 1801 and becoming a daily publication in 1821, is the world's second oldest English newspaper to be in continuous print. The Gibraltar Chronicle was established as the garrison newspaper, primarily concerned with military matters such as casualty lists at Britain's various theatres of war. The newspaper's most famous scoops include the report on the British victory at the Battle of Trafalgar and the death of Nelson in 1805, the Marie Celeste case, the sinking of the Utopia, and the wedding of John Lennon to Yoko Ono, to name but a few. The Chronicle printing press was originally housed within the Garrison Library complex, from its establishment all the way up to the 2000s, when the paper relocated. The buildings have remained empty since this time. However, the old Gibraltar Chronicle building on Town Range has been reclaimed by the Garrison Library to be restored.
And here we are in our most recent of restored spaces. Now this is the top floor of the Gibraltar Chronicle building that you will see from Town Range. It's been a beautiful project. We started with this project in December. We've only just taken possession over it. Contractors have handed over, and all our windows are open because we can still smell the varnish on the floors. These are original floors. Canadian pine. Surprisingly very well maintained despite its age. This was used originally as the Garrison Library Secretary's office and the accounts office. And as you know, the Gibraltar Chronicle and the Garrison Library were the same entity. So they would work and operate from the same premises. So for us this is important. It's an important space for the library history. Clearly this was an admin space. This room still has very grand dimensions. We have beautiful floors, beautiful fireplace, we just have a beautiful ceiling. And we've restored it, including all the coving, and we've now managed to secure 2 Georgian light fixtures in keeping with the period of this building, which have been reconditioned and should go up in the next few days. This room has been a revelation, I have to say, for 2 reasons. For one, we found a beautiful trap over here with great expectations that we'd find some hidden treasure. And instead we found 2 mouse traps, but really I thought that was an interesting touch. And then a beautiful fireplace as well. Even though the fireplace is quite modern, I think, in relative historical terms, the tiles around the fireplace depict the story of Cervantes' El Quijote. Talking to Dominic Searle, who of course, as you know, was a former editor of the Gibraltar Chronicle, he suggested that they date back to the 1970s. And now this raises an interesting point for us, for me as a historian clearly, but also within this heritage context in which we're speaking. Now the 1970s is very modern, I'd say, and many of us would have been born during the 1970s, if not before. But this is a heritage fireplace. These tiles form part of our heritage. And there's an indication over here of how do we term a heritage-worthy object or a building, and what heritage is. So heritage, I think, is not necessarily something that's old, that dates back to hundreds and hundreds of years. Certainly for Gibraltar, we keep on going back to the Great Siege as emblematic of a heritage in Gibraltar. This fireplace is heritage. It's 1970s. Before long, it will be 100 years old. And in hundreds of years' time, this is important. A point really, I think, that needs to be made, because if we only protect something or an object or building that's 200, 300, 400 years old, and then neglect to conserve anything after that, there'll be huge gaps in our history. So I thought that this fireplace was an important find, but also an important item to protect and to conserve. Some of you may recognize this room, some may not. As you can see, we're in the thick of restoration at the moment, and you've come at the perfect moment for us. This room has served as our office, but also as one of our main reading rooms, certainly since 2011, since I've been in post. We started the restoration of this room in January, and what we're attempting to do over here is to create a very calm reading room, a space where people can come and research. And to do this, what we've done is the following. We've clearly used period paint, Georgian paint, sage green, that reflects the building itself, so it's true to its moment, its historical milieu. We're also repairing the internal shutters, because we did have a problem with this room, beautiful as it is. The coving was starting to fall on our heads. Our contractors, who have been brilliant throughout, have restored the coving. They are now reconditioning and restoring our shutters so that they are properly hinged and closed properly. And what we've also done is, by way of offering a service to researchers who attend the library, is to have the electrics brought up from the basement, and we're having some floor sockets. Now this will hugely improve the service that we offer in terms of less trip factor, with everybody having their devices plugged in. As is the case now, but from a very neat floor socket context. So you can see this is a working library. And as a working library in this 21st century, it clearly is an 18th century institution, our aim above all is to make the space relevant and usable for our time, for our users. And decisions have been made clearly with the floor sockets in this respect. Ultimately, the balance is there. The balance is there to be true to the conservation of this space, whilst also making it relevant to the period in which we live now. This is a functional space, but a beautiful space at that.
Since the handing over of the Garrison Library to the Gibraltar government in 2011, the library has strived to become an intellectual and cultural centre for modern Gibraltar, bearing host to talks, seminars, musical performances, and the Gibraltar Literary Festival. In this way, the modern Garrison Library continues the academic intentions of its founders, but with the equality and inclusiveness of a modern society.
The library grows, well, really with the spread of the British Empire, and many officers would come to Gibraltar as their first posting before being sent out to other parts of the empire. But they'd continue their training over here, but they'd also use the library for their recreation. This room, you see it now set up in theatre style for conferences, and we do use this reading room for conferences. But it wouldn't have looked like this in the 19th century. There would have been large tables at the centre of this room with chairs. This would have been a smoking room. And rather than a room for conferences and for learning, most of its users, the officers of the garrison, would have used this space for their recreation, to smoke, to have a drink, to catch up on the news. London Times would be brought in. And clearly, this was a men's space. The Garrison Library, besides being a library, also functioned as a gentleman's club. Women were not allowed, which is very interesting when we come to think about some of the other rooms in this library where women were permitted. And that raises a question, so if women weren't allowed, how did they gain access to the library? And for that, I think we have to go to the ballroom. So here we are in the ballroom. Ladies were not permitted in the Garrison Library. This was a gentleman's club. but clearly they must have at some point, because here we have a ballroom, and so it's a sprung floor, and there was a grand piano in this room at one time. But ladies, as we know, were not permitted, and they would come in through the side entrance. They would have to navigate a beautiful wrought iron spiral staircase all the way up to this room. The only concession was that they had a ladies' bathroom installed up here, so they would not have to navigate that spiral staircase more than once in an evening.
Much how the masonry and stonework has borne the brunt of time, the delicate, priceless books filled with such valuable information and human experience have also been subject to deterioration, an issue the Garrison Library aims to address.
Here we have some books. We've just received a consignment of books that we have sent to the UK, to Oxford, to be restored. It's not only about paper conservation, but also rebinding. Traditionally, the Garrison Library would have had these skills in place because the printworks would have had bookbinders as well as printers. We now have to outsource this. Now, this is a gentleman's magazine. This collection is an important collection for the Garrison Library. It was badly hit around 2007 through water ingress. And we've been sending books over to the UK, to Oxford, for the past few years for their restoration. We've raised funds for this through private donations that come in, which is a great help, especially as book restoration is very expensive. Gentleman's Magazine is a wonderful resource. Anybody researching the history of the UK, but also of Gibraltar, there are wonderful articles over here on Gibraltar during the 18th century, 19th. For any researcher, this is an important book to be able to have access to. This is a 1782 volume for Gentleman's Magazine. The binding, we carefully selected the paper, it's all acid-free. We also carefully selected the leather binding on the back and the spine, and clearly we've respected the tradition in the Garrison Library of having all books gold foiled with Gibraltar Garrison Library. The paper, as you can see, it's still water damaged. It still has marks of historic damage over the years, but it's clearly legible. Beautiful, beautiful plates. All over here, it's of an eel. It's beautiful. The first steps, once the books reach the restorer, are to make sure that the paper quality can be restored at least to some degree. We can't wipe away history, but what we can do is make this paper more stable, and we can at times remove some of the watermarks and some of the foxing. Although this is also a very delicate process because we're applying chemicals to books. At the same time, we need to restore this and conserve it for future generations. It's very careful, a very expert process. And once the paper has been stabilized and restored, bookbinders take over, and also using acid-free materials. Everything in this library, because it's historic, needs special care, and acid-free materials are what we use throughout. Having gone through this process, we're now in a position to be able to offer our collection to members of the public, whereas books in terrible conditions have to be put to one side, have to be kept carefully sealed so as not to inflict further damage on them. As a library, books are our bread and butter, and without books we're nothing. The Gentleman's Magazine is a key aspect to our collection. In fact, we have a number of collections. We're a newspaper library, we have an important newspaper collection. We also have archives, and as part of our collections we have the full archive of the Royal Galpe Hunt, which is hugely important to us. It tells us a lot about Gibraltar during a period, 19th century right through to Second World War, about cross-border interactions, about how people lived over here. Ultimately, our history is about understanding how the space was used and how people lived in Gibraltar. Gentleman's Magazine also has its part to play. We have a wonderful collection on naval history, maritime history, on Morocco, North Africa, and on Spain. Gibraltar as a strategic point for many different reasons. We're right here bang at the edge of the Mediterranean, looking out towards the Atlantic. And so travellers who would come to Gibraltar would use Gibraltar as their point of departure, as their first and probably also last stop, especially once the Suez Canal is opened in 1869, I think. So we have a beautiful collection of travel narratives which tell us a lot not only about Gibraltar but about how we fit into this surrounding space. As a library, therefore, the Garrison Library is important. The heritage aspect of this building is hugely important for Gibraltar's heritage footprint. But ultimately, this building is designed to house and to protect books like this in our collections. And so our building has to be solid, has to be maintained to protect our collections and to ensure that we can offer, for generations to come, offer our collections to people in Gibraltar, but also any researchers who may visit.